Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be looking at Pydantic, a data validation tool that allows us to use type hints to carry out validations. Alright, so right now we are in our empty folder within VS Code, and the first thing we're going to do is to install our Pydantic. Now I'm going to pull up my terminal right here. I'm using git bash, but feel free to use whatever you may want. So I'm going to begin by using the virtualenv command. I'm just going to call it as a command. So I'll do that with Python. Then I'll call -m, then venv. And in this case, what I'll do is to call env, the name of our virtual environment. So once this virtual environment is created, I'm actually going to direct VS Code to use this as our virtual environment. So when I'm done creating the virtual environment, of course, I'll have to activate it and install our Pydantic using pip. So just like that, our virtual environment has been created right here. So I'm going to go ahead and activate it with source, env, and in this case, I'll have to go to the scripts folder and then call the activate script. Now, right after doing that, I'm going to go ahead and install our Pydantic. So I'll begin doing that with pip install and then Pydantic. So right after installing Pydantic, what I have to do is to create a model. So when validating data with Pydantic, we have to create a class that's going to define each of the fields that we are going to have in our data. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a module right here. So I'll close my terminal first. And I'll come right here and create a file. I'm going to call this main.py. And in our main.py file, I'm going to go ahead and call the base model class or import it from Pydantic. And after importing it, I'll create an instance of it that's going to allow us to define each of the fields that we shall have in our data. Now I'm just going to come right here and say from Pydantic, we are going to go ahead and import our base model. And right after importing our base model, now I'm going to go ahead and create a class. This class is going to define each of the fields that we shall have on our data. Now I'll just come right here and create a class. Now let's think of something we can create. So I'm just going to call this class a person class, and it's going to inherit from our base model. And right after importing this and inheriting from the class of base model, we're going to go ahead and define the types that this class is going to have. So each of the person we're going to have, each person we're going to have is going to have a username, and this username is going to be a string. They're also going to have an email, and in this case, we're going to have it as a string. Now they also have an age, and this age is going to actually be a string. Now, right after doing this, I'm going to go ahead and save. So what we've done is to define a model or define a model using our base model class. And this is having all the fields that we expect this person to have. Now, what is happening here is we are having these fields as defined with type hints. Now, the beauty with Pydantic is it heavily relies on type hints, and these type hints have advantages, just like we're going to see. So we defined a username that is a string, we've defined an email that is a string, we've also defined an age that is a string, but our age is actually supposed to be an integer, so I'm going to change it to be an integer. And what is happening here is we've defined this model class using fields, and these fields are defined using types that are our standard types. Now we're going to go ahead and pass some data into this model. So to do that, I'll just come right here and create an instance of our person class. So I'll come and say new person, and this new person is going to be an instance of person. So we shall provide some data that's going to go within each of the fields as defined in our model. So I'm going to come right here, and what I have to do is to define our data. So our data is going to be a dictionary containing the various fields that we have on our model. Now we're going to have a username in this case, and the value of the username is going to be, let's say, our test user. Now right after having our test user, I'm also going to go ahead and provide our email. So this is going to be our email, and our email is going to be our test user. In this case, it shall be at gmail.com. Now after doing this, then I'm also going to go ahead and define an age. So I'll provide an age, and this age is going to be, let's say, 24 years. Now that we have this data, let's go ahead and pass it within our model. So I'm just going to come right here on our instance of a person, and then what I have to do is to just simply unpack our dictionary within our instance. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this. Let's go ahead and also print this out so that we see what is actually going to happen. So I'll just come right here and say print, and in this case we're going to print a new person. Now that we print a new person, I'm just simply going to pull up our terminal and run our file with python main.py, and this is actually going to return a string representation of all the fields that we've defined on our class. Now this is beautiful because we've used type hinting and we've passed in the right kind of data. Now in this case what we've done is to define our fields with types, and these types are actually standard types. Now these types do not cater for things such as lists and other types, as we're going to see. Now I'm going to go ahead and add some attributes onto this class. Now let's say each person has a friend. We're going to look at how we can make this person have a list of friends. So I'm going to pull down this terminal, and I have to use the list class, or the list. I'm actually going to create a type of list that comes from typing. Now I have to come right at the top of our code right here, and all I have to do is to say from typing. So it actually uses also typing. So I'm just going to come and say we're going to import our list class, and after importing our list class, now we're going to go ahead and define what our list of friends is going to be. So I'm going to come right here and add an extra field. So this is actually going to be a friends field. Now let's just come right here and say that each person is going to have a list of friends. Now the way we're going to define this list is by coming right here, and then we're going to define it as a list, and shall specify that this is going to be a list of, let's say, strings, and we also give a default attribute. So in this case our default list is actually going to be an empty list of friends, and this is actually going to help us to define a list of friends. Now having had this, we can also add another field, or a field that's actually going to be of gender. Now the beauty with this is we're going to learn how we can be able to basically give choices to this kind of model. Now I'm just going to come right here, and all I have to do is to create a class. So this class is going to be an enum class, and it's going to have the different values for our gender. Now I'm going to create a class, and this class is going to be for our gender, and this is going to be an enum class, but it's going to inherit from two things. It's going to inherit from string as well as enum. Now once we have this, we can go ahead and import our enum class, which we haven't imported. So I'll just come and say from enum we are going to import our enum class, and using this we're going to define a choice of fields that our gender is going to have. Now I'm just going to come right here, and all I have to do is to define this as male, and the value for male is actually going to be male. So in this case we're going to say male, and then we are also going to define female. So in this case I'm going to come and say female, and in this case it's going to be female. And we can also have non-binary, so I'm just going to come and say that we're going to have a gender of non-binary, and in this case we shall have our value as non-binary. So now that we've defined this gender class, we can go ahead and define a type, or a field that's going to actually be for our gender. Now what I have to do is to come to our person and add this field. So I'll just come right here, and all I have to do is to say that we're going to have our gender field, and this is going to be of type gender. So by doing this, we're actually adding some compound types, stuff like the classes we create for ourselves, as well as classes that may come from the typing module within Python. Now when I go ahead and save this, we shall have to add these as extra fields to our class or our instance. Now I'm going to come within our data right here, and all I have to do is to add our friends, which is going to be a list of friends, and this list of friends is going to be a list. So in this case I may say it's going to have one user, so in this case we shall say test user 2, and this is going to be the only friend that test user has. Now I'm going to come and also provide a gender. So let's say we're going to come right here and we say that this person is going to have a gender. Now the way we can be able to access that gender and provide this gender as a value is to come and provide or access our gender class. So we can say gender, and then we access that specific field, and in this case I'm going to specify that our test user is male. So when I save this and go ahead and run our file once again, we now see that our fields have been added. We have our friends and we also have our gender being added onto this specific instance. At this point, we've been able to understand how Pydantic works. So Pydantic works in a way that it gets our data, validates it, and then returns our data in any form that you may want. So at this point, we've been able to create our own class with a list of choices of the various choices that we may have for that specific field. We've also been able to access one class or the list class from typing, and that has helped us to define a field that is a list. Now let us go ahead and look at one of the beauties of using Pydantic, and that is the validation part of it. So we're going to be able to pass a wrong data type within a certain field, and then we'll be able to print out a smooth error message or a very user-friendly error message. Now we need to close our terminal for now, and what I have to do is to import our validation error class. So the validation error class is one that allows us to basically view all errors that we may have in the definition of our data type using a certain model. Now I'm going to go ahead and import that from Pydantic. So I'll come and say from Pydantic, we are going to import our validation error. And right after importing our validation error, I'm going to turn our creation of our user instance into a try except block. I'm just going to come right here and I'll say we're going to try to create a new person with the existing data, and then we go ahead and print that person, and we're going to accept any validation error as an error. So I'm just going to come here and say we're going to accept any error, which is our validation error in this case, and we're going to accept that as E. And in this case, what we're actually going to do is to print out the error. So with this, I'm going to change some of the fields that we have for our data. So I'm going to begin by maybe tampering with our age. So let me change this age to a string, or let me actually define our age as 24, but in this case it's going to be a string, and I'm going to go ahead and save. So when I come right here, I'm actually going to enlarge my terminal so that you can be able to see the output. So I'll clear it with Ctrl and L and go ahead and run our file right here with python main.py. And right now we see that our age is being created, so it seems like our validations are not working. Let's actually see. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, maybe run it again. It seems like we don't have any validation errors for now. So what I can do in this case is to maybe define our friends list as something else. So I'm just going to pass a string right here. And what I'll do is to say, let's say we have a string, and this string is actually going to have a friend of John, which is not a list. So let's actually see the validations working. So when I run this, we actually see one validation error. And this validation error is saying that our value that we have provided for this field is not a list. So we can even return this as JSON, so that would be specific of which field in a much more user-friendly way. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I have to do is to pull up our validation error, and we can just call a .json method onto our validation error. So this is actually going to return our error as JSON. When I go ahead and save, I'm going to pull up our terminal, and when I run, we're going to be able to see our error as JSON in this case. So this actually works. So let's say we want to define our username as a string. So this is actually a string. Now for the age, we've defined our age as an integer, but in this case we're actually getting, it's actually returning no error. But let me try to provide, let's say, an age of John, and let's see what is actually going to happen. So in this case we actually see that we are getting two validation errors, and that is for our age, which is telling us that our age is not a valid integer. We're actually getting our friend, and our friends is actually also having a validation error, which is showing us that this is not a valid list. Okay, so for now we've been able to look at how we can get user-friendly validations from Pydantic. Pydantic also provides for us a way in which you can be able to customize our validations. Now this is done by using the field function from Pydantic. So what I'm going to do is to close my terminal right here, and then I'm going to go ahead and import our field function. So I import it from Pydantic by saying from Pydantic we're going to import our field, And right after importing our field, I'm going to go ahead and describe each of the validations that I may want to add to a specific field. Now I'm going to start with our username field right here, and I'll come and say that this is going to be equal to field. And within here, we can provide a default. So I'm going to provide our default username as none. And right after doing this, I can also provide attributes such as the max length. And in this case, we can say that we want our max length to be equal to 8. We can also provide a min length. Since this is a string, I can just come and say that we're going to have a min length, and let's say our min length in this case is going to be 2 characters long. Now I'm going to do the same thing for our email. So I'll come within our email and say that our email is going to be a field. Now this field is also going to have a default. So this default is going to be none for now. And right after doing this, I'm going to simply come right here and I'll provide a max length. And in this case, let's say the max length is going to be 8 characters long. And right after having this, we can also go ahead and do the same thing for our integer field, which is our age. Now I'm going to come here on our age, and what I have to do is to say that our age is going to be a field, and this field is going to have a min length, or actually, since it's an integer, what we can do is to define that we want an integer less than something, or greater than something, or greater than equal something, or greater than or less than equal to something. So in this case, what I'll do is to say that let our integer of our age be greater, less than, actually let's say it's less than 60, and let's say it's going to be greater than 18. So let's try to basically run this field, or run our user, and be able to pass our user with the various fields, and we'll be able to see if we have any validation errors. Now I'm going to pull up our terminal. I'll run our file with python main.py, and in this case we actually have our errors. So I think these are coming from what we have previously, so I'm simply going to remove some of the data we had. I'm going to change this to one integer. Now let's say it's going to be 12 characters. 12 as an integer, and then I have to change this to a list. So let's say I'll enclose the user John within our square brackets. Now pull up our terminal right here and run this. So now we see that we are actually having more advanced validations in this case. So what we have is we are able to check for our max length, and in this case we are having our username defined, but it has more characters than our required max length. And in this case we are actually having our age that's showing us that this value is actually less than 18. So we have been able to look at how we can provide more advanced validations on top of the fields that we've defined with Pydantic. Now let's go ahead and look at another interesting thing. When we create our model with Pydantic, we get access to some really interesting functions or methods. Now we're going to be able to look at them. So I'll pull down our terminal, and then after creating our new person, we can be able to access this person in various data types. Now what I'm going to do is to call some of those methods so that we can be able to make sense of what I'm actually talking. So I'm going to come right here, and when I say dot, now the beauty is when we use Pydantic, we are guaranteed that our editor is going to give us auto completions for all of the methods that we shall be able to need. And in this case, when I call our new person, we see that our VS Code is returning for us the various fields or the various attributes this new person object has. Now the attribute I want in this case is actually going to be that .json. And when I come and run this, so I'm going to save, and what I'll do is to come right here and run this. So I'll just say python main.py. This is actually going to go ahead and return our validation error. So let me go ahead and fix them. Now, what I'm going to do in this case is to provide an age that's slightly greater than 18 years. So let's say it is going to be 19, or let's say it's going to be 19. And when I go ahead and save this, I also change our test user. So let's say we're going to have our test. Actually, let's just call this our user. And when you have this as our user, I'm going to go ahead and run our file again, and when you run it, we actually have one more validation missing. So this is actually saying that we should ensure that the value has most 8 characters. So what we have as a problem here is we define this as our email, which is supposed to have 8 characters. So let's make this 80. And after making this 80, so when I run our file again, our validations are running. And at this point, we see that our user is now being returned as JSON. Now, if we wanted to run and be able to access this user as a dictionary, we can do the same thing with calling that .dict command or that .dict method onto our person object. Now I'm just simply going to come here, and all I have to do is to return .dict. And when I print this, in this case, we are going to access this as a dictionary. In the first example, we access this as a JSON object, and in this case, we're seeing this as a dictionary. Now, if we want to see our new person schema, or the schema from which we created our new person, we do that by calling that .schema object, or that .schema method, which is actually a method. Now, the way I'm going to do that is by coming right here, and I'll say new person, and in this case, we're going to say .schema. So we're going to call the .schema function, and when I go ahead and save this, in this case, when I come and run our main.py, we're going to see the various fields defined in a more advanced way. So this is a form that you cannot be able to see clearly. Now I'm going to be using the JSON module from Python to help us be able to print this out in a way that you can be able to read and understand. Now I'm going to pull down the terminal, and I'll go at the top of our code right here. I'll say that we're going to import, actually it's going to be import JSON. So I'm going to be using the dump function, and I'll come right here, and all I have to do is to maybe say that we're going to have our schema. So I'm just going to call this variable our schema, and when you have our schema, I'm just going to basically print JSON. So in this case, I'm going to say JSON.dump, and in this case, I'll have to specify that we're dumping our schema. And if we want some indentation, so I can go ahead and specify our indent. So I'm going to come right here, and I'll say, let me actually fix this. So I'll just come and say that we're going to have our indent as 4, so that we'll be able to see this as our object. So I'm just going to come right here, and when I run this again, actually we see that we are having that. So I'll actually come, I'm actually supposed to call that .dumps function instead of dump. Sorry for that. So when I come and run this, we now see a very descriptive model, or the schema that our model has. So let's go ahead and look at this and observe it clearly. So what we have here is the title of our class, or our model class, and it has our name as Python, or our person. And in this case, we have the type, which is object. So we can see the various properties that this model has. We have the username, which has a max length of 8, a min length of 2. We can see that it is of type string. And you can also be able to look at the email, which has a title of email, has the max length at 80. So we can be able to look at the various fields as well as the various validations on the fields. And you can also be able to look at our friends field right here and its description. We can also be able to access the various attributes, such as those fields that are required. So we actually have fields that are required. So when you come right here, we have fields where we did not specify a default, and Pydantic labels these as required fields. So when you go right here, we can be able to see that our descriptions, our definitions. So we have a gender that is of type gender, and this has a description of an enumeration, and it has the various values of male, female, and non-binary. I hope you get to understand it at this point. So using this, we can be able to see our schema in detail and be able to make sense of the various fields as well as the attributes that are located on those fields. Now, we can also be able to use Pydantic to access our environment variable files, and this is an interesting feature. So what I'll do is to create a .env file within here, but you can create them using your OS. You can also set them using your OS. I'm simply going to use an env file, and right after creating this env file, I'm simply going to come right in here, and all I have to do is to maybe provide an API key. So I'm going to set this to a Python secret. So I'll pull up our Python and then import secrets. So I'm going to generate a random secret. So I'm going to generate this with secrets.token hex. and this will generate for us this random hexadecimal value. So I'll just come and copy it from here, and when I copy it, I'm going to paste it in here. So we basically have our API key, so I'm just going to set this as our API key string. And once we have this, now we're going to be able to read this with Pydantic. Now we're going to do that by using the base settings class from Pydantic, and it's going to allow us to be able to access our .env file. So I'll begin by importing it. So I'll just come at the top of our code and then say that we're going to import our base settings class. Now after doing that, I'm just going to go down right this side. I'm going to comment this for now. And right after commenting this, I'm simply going to come right here and create our class. So this class is going to be, so I'm just simply going to come and say there's going to be a class of our settings. So within our settings, it's going to inherit from our base settings class. And right after inheriting from our base settings class, now we're going to go ahead and define whatever I want to access from our base settings or from our env file. Now what I have to do in this case is to provide our API key. Now this API key is going to be of type string. And right after doing this, then we shall have to define how we're going to be able to access this env file. Now I'm going to create a class which is the config class. And within this config class, we're going to be able to access our env file. So I'll begin by specifying our env file. So I'll begin by specifying env file. It's actually going to be an env file. And then I'll point to the exact file that we need to read from. Now in this case, it's going to be our .env file. And then I'm going to also come right here and specify our env encoding. Now this is important as different operating systems may have different encodings. So I'm just going to come here and say that our env encoding, so we are going to keep it to UTF and then 8. Now once we have this, we're going to be able to access our settings. Now to do that, I'm simply going to come right here and create an instance of our settings. Now simply going to come and say that our settings, or let me just say my settings, you're free to call them your settings, and this is actually going to be an instance of our settings class. And right after having this, when I go ahead and print this, we can be able to access my settings. So I'm going to go ahead and print this, and when I pull up our terminal, so I'll get out of our Python shell and then run our file with python main.py. So this is actually going to refuse to run because we need an extra python.env package to be able to run this. So I'll simply go ahead and run pip install python.env. It's actually going to be python.env, and this will go ahead and install our python.env. Now when we run this again, actually we shall run our file. So I'm going to clear my terminal and then run python main.py. So at this point we see that we can be able to access our API key, and this is great because it also provides for us a way we can be able to access our API key. Now let's say we wanted the value instead of the string representation of this whole settings class. I'm just simply going to close this, and right now I can just come and say my settings dot, let's say, our API key. And in this case, when I come and run this, we can be able to see that we are accessing this as our API key. So we can also choose to keep something secret, as we may not want other people to see them. Now what I'm going to do is to define a password. So I'll come to our env file, and then let's say we have our db password. So I'm going to keep this to db pass, and then I'll name it something like, let's say, password, and let's say 123. So when I go ahead and save this, we shall go ahead and basically access this. So I'll go to our main.py, and then I'm going to import one extra class. So this is actually going to be our secret. So I'm just going to define it as a secret string. And when you have this secret string, now we're going to go ahead and define our password. So I'm just going to come and say that on our settings class we shall have our db pass, and this db pass is going to be our secret. So in this case we shall define this as our secret. string. And once we have this, now we can also be able to access it. So when I go right here, I can simply print my settings. And when I save this and go ahead and run a file, I've actually not saved, so it seems like I have an error somewhere, but I don't have it. Let me go ahead, and it's actually here, so I'm going to remove it and then save. Now when I go ahead and run this, we now see that our DB pass is provided as a secret string to which we cannot know the value. Now this is amazing as it keeps our secret password secret. In this video, we've been able to learn how to use Pydantic. We've explored some of the most interesting features of Pydantic. My name is Jonathan, and on this channel I create programming videos. If you're interested in such videos, please like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, guys, and see you in the next video. Bye.